Welcome to People Power Social Club, our daily digital event space ensuring no one feels isolated or alone whilst we spend more time at home.
Guest speaker Dr. Alison Cooke has been an engineer for over 35 years. In this Part 1 talk, she will give an overview of the national energy plans and how nations can reduce their carbon emissions using the UK as a case study.
Hello and welcome everybody to my talk, Energy and Climate Change. I'm Dr. Alison Cooke and it's a pleasure to be here invited by People Power. They're obviously into promoting sustainable change and that's a subject very dear to my heart. So a pleasure to be with you and thanks for supporting us with this platform and recording this for future use. That's going to be great. People Power, I would recommend you go look at their website. They're a collective of professionals working really hard towards sustainable change, which as we're actually all doing it by hosting these meetings in the middle of the coronavirus and actually changing the way we behave at work and at home to cope with this lockdown. So perhaps that's some of the positives we can take away, sustainable change, so that we don't have to travel around as much and emit too many emissions. So energy and climate change, this is one part of a two-part talk that I'm doing for People Power. I'm used to doing this as one big talk, which lasts about 45 minutes. That what you see on the screen there is the sort of thing I might do. So when I was an academic, so I've been an engineer now for over 35 years. And you'll learn a little bit about what I've got up to over the years as an engineer. But one of the things I did was I worked for the University of Cambridge as an academic. And also I got to eventually be a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers in 2008. So I became one of those. And over the years, I've been asked to do various talks for different audiences. So obviously at the University of Cambridge, there was usually academic audiences or professional audiences, but also you'll see from this slide in 2016, I'm now a cruise speaker. So I was on the Queen Mary 2 giving this talk, Energy, Climate Change and the UN, Your Future in Their Hands. And it wasn't just a jolly, I promise you. I was very deliberate about that because when I left my post at Cambridge, I was definitely of a mind that there was enough talk going on in the research community. What we really needed to do with climate change was to get the facts out to the people. And at that point, we had no Extinction Rebellion. We had no David Attenborough being believed by the general public. And I was still meeting, even 4 years ago, quite a large number of skeptics in the audience. So I give talks to different audiences. So for the Queen Mary 2, it's sort of like a West End theatre, maybe 600 people in it. But also coming forward to this year, I will give talks to small community groups. So the one I did in January was hosted by a church. There are about 100 plus people there from the local community and around the north edge of Cambridge. But like I said, this talk is about the energy and climate change bit, that bit there. And tomorrow, or the second part of this talk, which hopefully you'll be able to watch on record, is climate change and the UN. So there'll be some overlap on climate change, but mostly tomorrow it will be about the United Nations climate change process. So does that make sense? Nods from people I can see on my screen. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so as I said, I'm splitting this down into 2 out of 3 of the chunks here. So this is the slide I would have used. So we're going to be doing energy and climate change today. And the second talk, part 2 tomorrow, will be climate change in the United Nations. So energy. Yes, I put my hands up. I, like you, we all use energy. And my first job as an engineer when I left Cambridge University, graduated in 1984. And my first job was for BP exploration in the North Sea. Now, again, going back all those years, at that time, there was absolutely very little in my head or in my news about climate change. It was not on the agenda. What was on the agenda was oil, 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 gas, gas, gas. We've got this abundance of resource that we can use, and everything in the UK, the North Sea was incredibly popular. It was a very popular job to get. And I have to say, it was a fascinating world to working in the North Sea, especially I was the first woman that they'd seen there in many instances. So that brought its challenges and its fun too. There's a whole nother talk on that if you're interested in it. But funnily enough for me, I left the oil industry after 2 years. And one of the reasons I left was I didn't feel comfortable working in that environment. One of the reasons was because I used to stand at the bottom of the platforms, particularly at night. It was very atmospheric. And I would look across the sea and there would be like candles dotted around the North Sea. And that was basically the platforms flaring off all the spare oil that wasn't economically viable to actually extract from the process. I remember asking the question, why are we burning all this energy, fuel, it's not economically viable. So fast forward nearly 34 years, and you'll be pleased to know that that no longer is an acceptable practice. It is against the law. So that question I asked, which made me feel uncomfortable at the time, has now come to fruition that actually in many parts of the world, this is no longer a practice. So there has been, I find these sort of subjects sometimes can get a bit demoralizing, but actually there is good news. And that's one of my good news stories. Things are changing. So yes, put my hands up. I worked for BP Exploration for a couple of years. And then fast forward to around about 2008, I worked in a whole different world in manufacturing engineering. I worked as an academic at Cambridge. But around about 2008, I realized that there was this big, big challenge that we were facing as a world to do with climate change. But it's all to do with you and I and how much energy we use. So the reason that energy and climate change is the two things that we put together in the title is because the energy we use is very simply correlated with the emissions we produce, and that then affects climate change. So if you need to leave now because your lunch is ready, that's pretty much what this talk is about, okay? But I'll elaborate. So I decided pro bono for free that as a new fellow of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, it would be only right for the future of my children. So Anna's with us today, but for the future of my children, I would want to be able to say to them, what did I do to try and help with this whole area? So I put my hands up at the Institute of Mechanical Engineers to get involved in this project. And it was all about, okay, it was launched by the Danish Society of Engineers, and it was a network of engineering institutions worldwide that were coming together to say, okay, if we want to achieve the Kyoto Protocol targets, more about that tomorrow, by the way, Kyoto Protocol, and how are we going to do it? And as engineers, how do we think this is viable, what governments are saying they want to achieve? For instance, the UK had just agreed an act of parliament, the Climate Change Act, to reduce in 2008 to reduce its emissions by 80%, 80, by 2050. So our job in Future Climate Engineering Solutions in the UK side of it, there were 12 countries involved at that point. But our job was to say, do we think this is doable? Do we think that we can reduce our emissions by 80%? And obviously, the whole point of that was to try and reduce emissions, reduce climate change, impacts on climate change, and reduce global temperature rise. And so I put my hand up to coordinate that project for the UK. And this is the plan we came up with. We then took that to a Copenhagen meeting with engineers and politicians and economists from around the world. We gathered in Copenhagen just before the Copenhagen United Nations conference, and we presented our president of the IMECHE presented our highlights from that plan. But what's quite important to me to share with you is who was in that team. I had to bring together a team that would properly represent what our industrial sectors would think was viable and feasible to do by 2050 in terms of emissions reduction. And these people I specifically chose that they were from sustainable energy backgrounds, but also traditional oil and gas and nuclear. So they were all on board to what we were trying to achieve. They all saw the report. So check my time here. We've had about 10 minutes. Okay, what were the headlines from that report? I can only give you a few. This is a whole hour's talk in itself. So I'm just going to give you a few slides for that. So for instance, looking at the numbers, because the key thing about this was at the time, and I think even now, the UK government does not know how it was going to achieve the 80% reduction in emissions. Similarly, I would like to suggest that the government currently does not know how it would achieve Theresa May's target for zero emissions in 2050. There is an organisation called the Climate Change Committee who is supposed to advise government on this. But at the time in 2009, when we published this report, they were not saying anything as radical as this. And there was no plan for how the UK was going to achieve the emissions target. So to look at one energy scenario, that's all we did, one energy scenario. For instance, our consumption in 2006, that was a complete data set at the time, was saying you would normally have a third of your energy consumption would be for transport. A third of it would be for industry. That's the orange piece of pie. A third of it would be to do with housing. That's all of us in our houses. And about 10% or 11% of it would be the energy you would need to produce energy. So that's, you always need some energy to produce energy. Now, even though the overall pie size would have changed for 2020, usually it's about that sort of 10% for energy consumption, and then a third and third and a third for the other sectors. So if we were to achieve back in 2009, if we were to achieve 80%, just 80% reduction in emissions, what would we have to do to our energy demand? That is our demand, all of us, on the system. And you'll see that the pie reduces in size. That is, you'll have to take my word for it, it's a 50% reduction in the size of that circle. So all of us, you, me, everyone here, we would all have to reduce our demand for energy by 50%. That was in order to make the 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. Not only that, not only that, but we would have to ramp up on every possible energy source that we could think of. So if this is a graph, which is a timeline, vertical axis is the gigawatts output capacity onto the national grid, okay? And along the x-axis is a timeline. So at the time we were in 2009, we were here. So for instance, we would see gas diminishing, we would see coal diminishing, we would see nuclear ramping up, we would see wind radically ramping up, and so on across all the renewable energies. Now that at the time was very radical. Since then, you have all seen dotted around the UK, most mega numbers of wind turbines, huge. It's caused all sorts of trouble for residents. They don't want them, and they've seen them popping up there and say, do we really need this? Well, at the time of doing this report, we were saying this was about an 80% increase from here up to here, but 80% increase in our wind energy capacity. And what our sustainable energy engineering friends were saying to us on the working group was, we can't possibly ramp up that fast. You're going to actually have to ask the nuclear sector to ramp up more. And when we went to the nuclear sector and said, how about this? This is like probably about 3 times the amount of nuclear energy we would need. Whatever your sort of political thoughts about nuclear energy and its waste and whatever, in order to meet those targets, we would need to ramp up 3 times on nuclear. And the nuclear friends in our collegiate system were saying, no, we can't possibly do that. Why don't you go and have a talk to the sustainable energy ones? So what I'm trying to say, obviously, is that we couldn't see how the numbers would work. And since then, we have seen a huge increase in wind energy, but we have not seen very much reduction in demand. All of us, are still trying to take more and more energy out of the system. So how is it all going to work? Where have I gone backwards? Oh, right. So going back to this wonderful man, David IMECHE, here is the good news. So again, this sort of subject can make people feel quite despondent, but the good news about this was he was then at the heart, David McKay was then at the heart of government. And I was very fortunate because I had a line into him at my job at Cambridge University. He was very supportive of future climate engineering solutions. He then developed, so if you want to find out more about his work, and I would absolutely heartily recommend you read this book. If you don't want to buy it, you can get it free online. I hope you can see this without www.without hot air. So he made it completely free for people who couldn't afford the book or didn't want to buy paper. You can get it free online. And I've had a meeting with the publishers, and they are actually updating the numbers because the sort of trends in the book are the same, but obviously the numbers will have changed. And the sort of thing he was saying was, if the red stack is all the stuff we demand, so if that's all the energy we're saying we need, so for instance, like an average person in a year might use this much of kilowatt hours per day, an average person for one transatlantic flight might use this, you'll see the numbers are quite stark. That one flight is equivalent to an annual use of our car. All right. So if you get that's hence the absolute, you will have heard many of you, the absolute need to reduce the amount of flights we take. Similarly, if you then said, I'm going to ramp up in an Apollo-like effort every single energy source, like from wind to solar, to photovoltaic farms, to biomass, to offshore and onshore wind, to tidal, to waves, if you were to have a gargantuan effort on all those energy sources, you would still not meet the energy demands of 2008. So that's hence going back to our IMECHE plan, you need to reduce your energy demand substantially for this to work. Okay, again, what was really positive news about this was that because David was then at the heart of government reporting to Ed Miliband, in fact, I had this very surreal experience one Sunday morning. I love the Andrew Marr show, and Ed Miliband was being interviewed as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change by Andrew Marr. And in that interview, he was given a very difficult question by Andrew Marr about the IMECHE's report on energy. And he basically was frustrated by the report. And he said, well, they must have it wrong. And that morning in my dressing gown, I had a call from David McKay saying, what is the IMECHE doing, putting this stuff out without speaking to me? Because I've now got Ed Miliband on the phone saying to me, why on earth is the IMECHE churning this stuff out? So it was a very surreal experience. But what was good about all of that for me was that David McKay was at the heart of government. And he said to me personally, I had to host him at a dinner, and he said, unless Ed Miliband was listening to me in things I was saying, Alison, I would not renew my contract as Chief Scientific Advisor, because he really, really walked the talk, David. And so what he did as part of Whitehall, working for Ed Miliband, and in fairness to the Conservative government and the coalition government afterwards, the budget was not cut after the government changed from Labour to coalition and then to Theresa May. I have it from people within the system that the budget was not cut. This calculator you can all play with now. It's an online tool whereby all of us can see how we might fluctuate and vary our energy demand, and at the same time change our energy sources to see if we, the public, can make the numbers add up. So if you think back to that IMECHE plan I was telling you about, essentially what this tool does is give you an opportunity within milliseconds to actually create a lot of those plans. So you can flux, you can say, I don't want nuclear, I don't agree with nuclear, let's get rid of it. Can you then meet the energy demand of the United Kingdom? Okay, you want to make an 80% or even a 0% reduction in emissions in 2050. Can you actually do that by increasing wind energy? And how would you do it? So I heartily recommend this calculator to you. Again, like I said, it's still live. It's still inside Whitehall. And it's online for all of us to use. And I would heartily recommend you have a play with it. Just have a play with it and see if you can achieve what the government's having to set out to achieve. This is the sort of thing it will look like if you have a play. So on this side, we would have demand, so transport. So for instance, for me, when one of our headlines from our plan in 2009 was to totally electrify domestic transport, in 2009, we were saying this at the IMECHE. This year, Boris Johnson has announced 11 years later that we will all of us need to move to electric cars. And it can be very frustrating for me because we knew this over a decade ago, but finally it's good news that finally the government has actually got to the point where it's been honest and said, yes, we're going to have to achieve it. We're going to have to do this. So you'd play around with the demand, different sort of levels of effort, 1 to 5, and then you'd play around with the energy sources, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and so on, and then you'd see what would happen to your emissions if you play around with that. Okay, so I heartily recommend that with you. It's a positive way to end this talk this morning, this lunchtime, and I'm going to talk some more about the climate change angles and how this stuff feeds into the United Nations and exactly what they're trying to achieve at the COP meetings. Particularly looking forward to the UK hosting the next United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. So I will leave you with that thought. It's a really important strategic time for us in the UK to be hosting the United Nations Climate Change Conference. And that's going to be the one of the main subjects of my talk tomorrow. So I think I will just flick through these last few slides about climate change. I'm sure many of us here are very aware that emissions will affect the climate, and that this is a reality now. But you wouldn't believe how many skeptics I've still heard. This slide shows you what happens to the emissions. What happened to the emissions in 1769. So this is scientists all over the world are represented by these different coloured dots. And in 1769, those of you who are engineers will probably realise that is the arrival of the steam engine, the Industrial Revolution. We all started burning coal, and the amount of carbon dioxide, ppm, parts per million, that we produced as a world rocketed. If you're not still sure that climate change is a reality, then I would recommend you go to the International Panel on Climate Change website. They are, again, probably scientists from 70 different countries worldwide who all feed into the climate change debate. They have got some interesting stuff on why climate change is a reality. It's basic science, the greenhouse effect. And this slide, which you can have a look at later when you maybe get the recording of this talk, it explains, just like your greenhouse in your garden, if you've got more gases in the atmosphere, then you will trap more of the solar radiation inside the atmosphere, which will make the Earth warm up. That's the basically quick summary of that slide. But there are places you can go and look at that in more detail. You will have seen with David Attenborough's work that the glaciers are melting. This is two photographs given to me by a dear friend who was a polar scientist, Dr. Charles Swithinbank. He was a fellow of the Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge. He took these pictures, the same glacier, the same season, from the same vantage point you can see from the geography in the Antarctic. This is the glacier in 1941, and this is the glacier in, I can't quite see it under the video screens, but it's 2000 and something. We can let you know that later if you're really interested, but it's past the millennium, and this is the same time of the year, and the glaciers are retreating. So this is a reality that we are all facing. We have to do something about urgently.
Stay safe, stay busy, and tell us a cool story next time we see you.